around the world and moving very often to neighboring countries which are developing countries, poor countries. So in a context of increasing inequalities and poverty. That's why we titled this session, Refugees in an Unfair World. And I have the pleasure to start this session with the UN High Commissioner on Refugees, Filippo Grandi. So my first question to Mr. Grandi is, what are the far-reaching consequences of the unprecedented humanitarian crisis in Ukraine, and what are the specific consequences for the European Union? Please, Mr. Grandi.
Thank you very much. First of all, I am very honored to participate in this global policy forum. I'm very, very sorry that I cannot be in person with you as I would have liked, but glad that I can contribute to this very important debate. And the question of the Ukrainian forced displacement movement has so many ramifications. The question is extremely important. First and foremost, I think the question applies to Ukraine. This is the largest exodus of people, forced exodus of people that we have seen in decades, possibly since the Second World War. More than 6 million people gone outside of Ukraine, millions and millions displaced inside the country. And this is first and foremost a humanitarian problem. And it has been responded to with great generosity outside the borders of Ukraine by European states that have taken in lots of refugees. And it has also been, we have tried to work with the Ukrainian government to meet the needs of those displaced inside the country. But those needs are monumental. And they're not just material needs, but they are also what we would call protection needs. Women and children are the majority of those who have fled outside the country. There is high risk of women being trafficked. There's many children that I wouldn't say are orphans, as has been said many times, but are separated from their families. So their situation needs a very careful examination before being taken care of. And the list of needs and responses is very long. But I would say that there are two issues related to this exodus that need to be kept in mind very, very, with a lot of attention. The first is that we believe that by and large, this movement is temporary. Most of the families that have left are actually only parts of the family. The women, the children, some elderly people, some people with disabilities. In other words, people that are not fighting the war in Ukraine. And most of the people fleeing, especially the refugees, are telling us as soon as we can go back, we will go back. So I think it is very important that return begins being factored into the planning for the next steps in handling this crisis. We don't know what the political evolution is, but it is important to be ready for when people will say, we want to go back voluntarily to our homes, because that will be very intimately related. In fact, will become a major element in the reconstruction program, which will be the big challenge in Ukraine once, hopefully, peace comes back to the country. The other dimension that I would like to stress, there's many others, but the other one that I'd like to stress is that Europe, or let me be more specific, many European politicians have been telling us for now years and years that Europe is full, that it cannot take any more people coming, knocking at its door, either, poor people in search of opportunities, what we would call migrants, or people that we deal with fleeing war and persecution, discrimination, what we would call refugees. They're full, we have to push them back, build walls, the boats cannot land on our shores. Well, in the space of a few weeks, Europe has been able to take in 6 million, actually more than 6 million Ukrainian refugees. They have adopted a temporary protection directive, 20 years old, but they finally adopted it now. So that proves a point that Europe, if it works together with political will, it can exercise the solidarity that we have asked Europe to exercise for a long time for other refugees as well. I fully appreciate Ukrainians come from next door. Many have families and relations and communities. Many have skills, even some resources. So in a way, it's maybe easier to include or integrate them. But this does not exonerate us from having the same solidarity towards other people. This is a responsibility of the politicians to do that. So there is now a big precedent that we will invoke, and we hope that this Europe will build on this to have a better asylum policy and practice.
Thank you, Mr. Grandi. You have just mentioned that Europe has shown resolve and solidarity. So what remains to be done by the European Union and the international community as a whole to help refugees? Please.
I would say that the big challenge for European countries that have received refugees, until such time as that hospitality will be necessary, is to ensure that they have access to services and, where possible and necessary, to employment. This is a big challenge. But I was very struck. I remember I visited Poland I think it was the very beginning of March, a week after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and Poland was already receiving hundreds of thousands of people. And the prime minister, the government told me, it's great that everybody's bringing relief supplies, blankets, food, medicines, that's fine. But what we really need to think about from the day one is including these people in our services. Kids have to go to school, people will be sick and we'll have to use our health systems. And then, we will give them cash, we are giving them cash, but that's not enough. They will have to have some revenue, some self-sustaining income. So access to the labor market, etc., etc. Now, I find it remarkable that Europe started thinking about inclusion so early in a refugee emergency. But this is unfinished work. And especially if refugees will stay for a protracted period of time, and it is possible, at least for some of them, it is important to accelerate that inclusion, because if we leave them excluded, then tensions will begin to rise. Then rejection will begin to be perceived. Then, unfortunately, some politicians will start exploiting that. So I think it's important that Europe continues. We are there to advise more than to help, because this is a European matter, but it's important to do that. The other point that I'd like to make is a more general point that, in the interest of what my organization does. This inclusion first is the most important thing that we should do in every crisis of refugees. Humanitarian relief is often vitally needed, but right at the same time, we should start talking about inclusion. This would diminish so much the perception that refugees are a burden, are a threat and a risk, because inclusion does exactly the opposite. It's good for them, but it's good also for the communities receiving them. Colombia, Uganda, there are countries that have done a lot in this area, and I hope that what Europe is doing now could be a further model for places where it is still more problematic.
Mr. Grandi, unfortunately, we have to conclude, but let me ask you if you have a final message to convey. This morning, I asked also Ambassador de Mistura what we can do in order to have all the other conflicts not to be forgotten, which is the real risk. So what's your view? What's your take on this?
Well, I am not only the head of UNHCR, I represent the United Nations, the one global organization. And my message is that, yes, there is enormous attention focused on Ukraine, also in the humanitarian area. And we understand why. The gravity of the crisis is such that it justifies this attention. However, it is very important that the UN And in general, the international community does not forget all the other crises. Once the Ukraine war started, one of the first things I did after visiting the refugee countries was to go to Afghanistan. And then I went to Cameroon. I wanted to flag the importance of this crisis, the importance of keeping political attention towards resolution of this crisis and keeping the resources that are needed to respond both in the humanitarian and development field. Otherwise, we may solve Ukraine and we will be left with crises that meanwhile, also as an effect of Ukraine, have become worse and more difficult to resolve.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Grandi. Now, let me move to our second keynote speaker for this session, Ms. Carolina Sanchez-Paramo is Global Director of Poverty of World Bank. Ms. Paramo, thank you very much for being with us today. So now we move to the other part, to the second topic, if you want, of this session, which is poverty and rising inequalities. And we know that unfortunately a food crisis could be just around the corner after the Ukraine war. So what can we do to avoid a scenario like this, and what the World Bank in particular, your organization, is doing to prevent this? Please.
Thank you, Antonio. It's really a pleasure to be here. And, like the previous speaker, I'm sorry that I couldn't join in person, but I just got a bit of the last part of your previous discussion, and it's clear that you're having fascinating discussion there. As you said, we are indeed living through a very challenging moment. We had made significant progress in the fight against extreme poverty in the decades preceding COVID, but of course the pandemic has reversed that and has actually caused the first increase in extreme poverty that we've witnessed in over 2 decades. And this is likely to be further exacerbated, as you said, by the consequences of both the Ukraine conflict, which we were just talking about, and rising inflation around the world, particularly food inflation. We at the World Bank estimate that because of this compounding crisis, COVID, war, also climate change to some extent, we are likely to see 75 to 95 million additional people living in extreme poverty this year, 2022, compared to what our pre-pandemic projections were for this same year. Rising food prices are particularly devastating for the poor and the vulnerable. And in fact, we estimate that for each 1% rise in food prices, we could see up to 10 million more people living in extreme poverty. These are pretty large and dramatic numbers, particularly if you put them in the historical context. In addition, this spike in food prices could also worsen hunger, right? So it's not just about poverty, it's poverty that is really what we call deprivation, right? Families, kids going hungry. And we already know that hunger was an issue before the pandemic, and it was already alarmingly high in many parts of the world due to conflict in those areas, extreme weather, and pests. So I want to echo what we just heard, right? It's important that we don't forget that the world didn't just go into a crisis when the Ukraine conflict started, right? That there were many crises unfolding in many countries, and in some cases across countries before this happened. In fact, more than half of the population in low-income countries are currently experiencing food shortages. And even in countries where food insecurity is low, price increases and disruptions to the supply chain are really tipping many people into extreme poverty. For example, the latest data that we have suggests that between January and April of this year, almost 90% of emerging market and developing economies experience food price inflation greater than 5%, with many experiencing double-digit inflation. We haven't seen anything like this since the financial crisis. And in 70% of the countries, food price inflation exceeded, and in many cases exceeded by a lot, overall inflation. And unfortunately, I think we all sense that this is likely the situation, that this is likely to continue for the next few months and potentially over a year. And this is why I think we really need to all make a call for countries and the development community at large, which I know it's represented in this conference, to take urgent action, to both lessen the impact of higher prices in the immediate term, but also just to ensure over the longer term that the poor and the vulnerable have access to food in a way that is more continuous and not disrupted when something happens in the international markets arena. So how do we do this? I want to put four ideas forward, and then I'll say a couple words on what the bank is doing specifically. First, we need to avoid measures such as trade restrictions, which can actually risk exacerbating price increases rather than mitigating the problem. Second, we need to strengthen social safety nets and provide well-targeted and cost-effective cash transfers to vulnerable households whenever that's possible, to help them cope with prices that are already high. Third, we need to facilitate farmers' access to financing. This won't have an impact immediately, but it will be critical to ensure that we don't have a similar problem when the next crop comes around. Because today we know that some of these farmers are struggling to buy fuel, fertilizer, seeds, all the inputs that they need to ensure that we will have a strong crop the next time around. And then finally, it's important that we start investing to transform food systems so that they are more productive, more resource efficient, and more resilient overall. So again, a mix of short-term and longer-term policies. So what are we doing at the World Bank? We are doing exactly that, engaging with countries on short-term measures and longer-term measures. As part of our sort of comprehensive response to this compounding crisis, we have made available up to 30 billion over the next 15 months in both existing and new projects. We are also mobilizing support through IDA, which is the World Bank's fund for the poorest countries. And specifically, we are really utilizing the IDA crisis response window, which offers $1 billion in early response financing to address acute food insecurity and disease outbreaks and prevent them from becoming full-blown crisis. So this is a window that is always available and of course has been heavily utilized over the last couple of years, as you can imagine. In fact, since the start of IDA 19 in July 2020, we have allocated over 530 million across 11 countries through this program. For example, in Yemen, we've allocated $50 million from the early response finance window to improve the availability of food and nutritious diets and enhance the overall country's capacity to respond to future food security crises. But much more needs to be done, there's no doubt. We are also working with countries, as I said, towards a longer term, trying to transform their food systems and to support a green, resilient, and inclusive recovery from this crisis. And then finally, the World Bank and the G7 presidency are sort of co-convening the Global Alliance for Food Security, which is an initiative that aims to facilitate the sharing of best practices and to catalyze an immediate and coordinated response to this crisis, something that was also pointed out earlier, this need for coordination. Let me stop there.
Yes, from your words, it's clear that the food crisis has an unfair impact because it's heavier on vulnerable groups. So my question is, in particular, what is the potential impact on refugees, which are very peculiar, vulnerable group, and how can we spur developed countries, rich countries into action? Please.
Absolutely. As I said earlier, the poor, the vulnerable are always the least able to cope with the consequences of crisis. And of course, displaced populations, refugees, are vulnerable within the vulnerable, right? So we do know that high food prices will hurt the poor and the vulnerable the most. So let me talk a little bit about that and then zoom into refugees. Poor families around the world typically spend about 2/3 of their income on food. While in a high-income country, and I think for many of us, this is probably true, a typical person spends much less, about 25%. So So this means that when food prices increase, it has a much higher impact on the overall ability to consume other things for a poor family than a non-poor family. We also know that at times of crisis, and particularly at times of economic crisis, poor and vulnerable groups are likely to adopt coping strategies that could potentially result into food insecurity and damaging effects over the long term. For example, data from the Joint Data Center on Forced Displacement shows that access to food and food security were major concerns for forcibly displaced families even before the war in Ukraine. And the situation has only worsened since because of rising prices and the associated decline in incomes. For just a couple of examples from two countries so that you get a sense for the magnitude. In Bangladesh, 54% of refugee households reported buying either lower quality or cheaper food items just to cope. And 43% of these refugees reduce food portions or skip meals entirely. Similarly, in Chad, where food insecurity is a continuous challenge that predates COVID-19, but that got exacerbated, obviously, as a consequence of the crisis, nearly 87% of refugee households experienced severe food insecurity in early 2021. So here you have groups that are already vulnerable, already in difficult circumstances, resorting to consuming less food, in many cases not having food at all, or replacing more nutritious foods with foods that are less so just because they are cheaper. So yes, this food crisis can have a substantial impact on the lives of these groups, including, of course, as I said, the forcibly displaced. And I just want to highlight something that you said at the beginning in your introductory remarks to this session, and that's the fact that the population of forcibly displaced has more than doubled over the last decade alone, reaching over 100 million people globally. So we are truly living a crisis within a crisis here. So in this context, countries, both advanced and developing, need to adopt policies that effectively tackle the problem and stay away from policies that are counterproductive. Take trade restrictions, for example, which I already mentioned. Export curbs on food can amplify problems and lead to higher prices. They don't resolve the structural issues. And yet we see several countries having taken this kind of action over the last few months. We know, for example, that the bans on wheat exports imposed between the beginning of the war and May, so in just a period of a few months, impacted more than 1/5 of world trade. And were responsible for a 9 percentage point increase in world wheat prices. Think about the magnitude of that impact just coming from trade restrictions. Measures like this basically not only exacerbate the impact that this crisis is having on the vulnerable, but also could lead to a tit-for-tat escalation that could further pronounce the crisis. Countries should also refrain from putting in place price controls for food or energy, which has been shown again and again to be both ineffective and costly. And they should instead use cash transfers to compensate those that need it. Okay. And yet we know that there's a large number of countries that are doing exactly that, using subsidies instead of strengthening social assistance to address the crisis. As of April, 84 countries had announced a total of 221 programs, various programs, to respond to this crisis. Subsidies, including for fuel and food, accounted for 79% of the total response. So basically, they were the most popular measure used, despite the fact that
may I invite you to conclude, unfortunately, because we are running out of time.
Sorry. Yes, I'm just closing.
Thank you.
And similarly, in contrast, we see that social assistance only accounted for 17% of the response. Again, massive contrast. So to your question, just to close, advanced economies should implement the right policies at home and should support governments in low-income countries and middle-income countries in doing the same through, of course, financing and advice, but also through international cooperation. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. We truly appreciate your contribution. So now I leave the floor to Maria Cuffaro for the panel discussion. Thank you again, Ms. Spram.
Well, welcome back, and I'm sorry, of course, that, it wasn't Paolo Magri, it was the old notes that I had, and soon you will see the real Paolo Magri, but first, let's come to this panel that was, of course, introduced wonderfully by Grandi for a UNCR. Let's keep on talking about, this is probably the biggest challenge that we do face. Refugees in an unfair world, that is the title, and it sums up rather neatly what the problem is, because as you heard before, for the very first time in 30 years, inequalities and poverty is rising in the world. And we heard 10 more million people are under poverty line. Those are not just numbers, those are people. So now we'll try to focus on how to avoid this vicious circle of poverty and instability, and of course, the pandemic and the war in Ukraine that accelerates these challenges and these problems. And so we'll try and focus how to reduce the gap between rich and poor, which is widening, especially in developing countries. And as you see on stage, I've been joined by Giovanni Fosti. Welcome, thank you for being with us. President of the Fondazione Cariplo. And online we are connected with Priyadarshi Dash from New Delhi, Associate Professor of RIS, Indian think tank, Delhi-based. Welcome, thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Maria. Good evening.
Good evening. And we are also joined by Tetsushi Sonobe, Dean and CEO of the Asian Development Bank Institute. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Maria.
So I would start here with Dr. Fosti. You're president of the Fondazione Cariplo, which is one of Italy's main charitable foundations. And you do say that inequality concerns everyone, so even you. How can we help reduce these inequalities? And to this aim, what's the role, according to you, that education has?
Well, good afternoon, and let me say that it's an honor for me to be part of this panel, and I wish to thank ISPI, Bocconi, OECD and T20 Indonesia for hosting this forum. Well, I would start by saying that facts and figures are really clear. Inequalities are rising. In Italy, for example, according to Istat, between 2019 and 2021, the number of people living under absolute poverty increased by 1 million. But this is not happening only after the pandemic. It is taking place in the context of transition as the digital and the environmental ones. So this transition risks leaving part of our communities behind and to create fragmentation. So how can we deal with contrasting inequalities? I would like to say that this is, of course, a moral issue, but it is not only a moral issue. What I mean, contrasting inequalities, of course, is a matter of justice. It is morally unacceptable that our communities leave behind so many of their members. However, this is not all. There is also a sort of pragmatic reality. Inequalities hinder the development of our society. So we should also think about how inequalities are changing. Who is getting poorer? A growing type of inequality concerns the youth. Italian minors living in absolute poverty are more than 1.3 million, and the phenomenon of need is rampant. They form 20% of Italian youth between 15 and 24. So the reality makes it clear that reducing inequalities is not only about justice, it is about building the future of our country. And in a moment when we think of reconstruction after the pandemic, we can't imagine a future when 1 in 4 young people are inactive. So education is key to contrasting inequalities, and for us, this started by activating the resources of our communities in response to the learning loss caused by the lockdown. To contrast the digital divide created by online learning, we activated a social supply chain of refurbished devices. Then, in the tutoring online program with Bocconi University, maybe some of people participating in this program are here. Bocconi University, Bicocca, and Harvard University students supported younger students facing learning difficulties. Third point, contrasting inequalities is also about securing the future of democracy. Inequalities break social bonds and create fragmentation. Trust and community bonds are essential to democracy. They ensure people's participation and interest in democracy. This also means that to reduce inequalities, we need to build community bonds again, creating the social infrastructure that promote trust. For example, Fondazione Cariplo supported the third sector organization that were struggling to survive during lockdown in 2 editions of the Let's Go project. Thus, reducing inequalities is not only about supporting the vulnerable parts of our communities, but also finding the resources that our communities already have. This has to happen with our eyes pointed at the younger generations, which have been affected the most. We can't leave them behind and deprive them of the desire to build future.
Well, thank you. And you, as you mentioned in your speech, it is a moral question, the economical divide. A moral question calls for ethical answers from politics, but also from finance. And I wanted to ask Dr. Sonobe, now we have the Ukraine conflict and China's lockdown that has been slowing down Asia's economic growth as well. And how would you address these risks, and in particular the risk of financial stress in developing countries?
Okay, thank you, Maria. Thank you, ISPI. Yeah, good evening from Tokyo. It's an honor and a pleasure to participate in the Global Policy Forum. I'm so sorry that I cannot join you in person. So the war in Ukraine has caused the grain price hike and energy price hike, which pushed up inflation rates in the developed and emerging economies and threatened food security and energy security in developing countries. So equally problematic are the supply chain disruptions caused by the lockdowns of major cities in China. So many factories in many countries stopped. The supply chain disruptions, together with the fuel price hike and the food price hike, have aggravated the inflation, which in turn put pressure on FRB to raise US interest rate. And monetary tightening in the US and other advanced economies will further drive up the cost of debt and make international refinancing ever harder for the global south. The default of Sri Lanka and the crisis of Pakistan are known by the world, but similar problems are serious across the developing world. According to the IMF, the share of low-income countries that are at high risk or are already in debt distress has doubled since 2015, up from 30% to 60%. Not only low-income countries, but a growing number of middle-income countries are suffering from high debt service burdens. Debt to GDP ratios and the external debt service to government revenue ratios had been on the rise already prior to the COVID-19 crisis and have further increased considerably for the last 2 years. Such a situation is not only threatening economic recoveries, but it's also impeding much needed investments in climate resilience and Agenda 2030. So to cope with protracted liquidity and insolvency problems, G20 has put in place the common framework for debt treatment to restructure and, if necessary, forgive debt in low-income countries. The major concern is that this common frame lacks a mechanism to incentivize private creditor involvement and suffers from some other weaknesses. So against this backdrop, the T7, Germany, task force on sustainable economic recovery, in which I participated as one of the 3 co-chairs, made some proposals, including the following. G7 should reform the IMF and the World Bank's debt sustainability analysis to fully include climate and sustainability risks and investment needs. G7 should create legal safeguards for debt restructurings and limiting opportunities for holdouts to derail negotiation processes and outcomes, and increase incentives for private creditor participation in reprofiling and restructuring, respecting the principle of comparable treatment of creditors. The last point, besides, we think that World Bank and other multilateral investment banks could set up and export credit programs for developing countries whose terms of trade have deteriorated because of the war and sanctions. I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, because you outlined the goals that have to be achieved. Now, let's go back to reality, and we link up to Delhi, where, according to Forbes, the numbers of billionaires in Delhi has increased from 102 in 2020 to 166 in 2022, so in just 2 years. And according to the World Inequality Report, India is one of the most unequal countries. So probably it's a good example to ask you, how can India achieve the sustainable development of all of the Indians and close this widening income gap between the have-nots and the haves? Professor Dash.
Thank you, Maria, for this very interesting question. First of all, I'm sorry for this mess up with that in the beginning of the session. Before I get into the India story, let me spend half a minute on what is happening globally. From the very start of the development discourse in the 50s, when most of the countries were getting independence from their respective colonizers. So that time, the idea that predominated the thinking was some sort of welfare state. Then we experimented with various combinations of the public sector, private sector models. Then we had experimented some sort of development state model in East Asia, Singapore and other countries, where we were a bit of success to tell to the rest of the world. Then the whole story of market economy, that we need to give a big space to the private sector to contribute. And then we landed in market economy. Now, what has happened? Growth has coexisted with inequality and poverty in all these major paradigms shift in the economic development thinking. So what I'm telling you that at the time of independence, India inherited a significant level of poverty and deprivation. Then the mixed economy model, where government had an upper hand over designing the policies, paid back in terms of playing a level playing field, providing a level playing field to see the monitoring of the progress that is made. Now coming back to that, if India is so unequal, then how can India achieve sustainable development goals? Or sustainable development for that matter. If you see the policies in the last decade, there has been a significant stress on addressing vulnerability at the grassroots level, like energy, access to low-cost energy, providing relief from the indebtedness, so ease of living kind of things. In fact, the incumbent government in the last 8 years have given thrust on those dimensions exclusively, so that the access to affordable credit, access to energy, I don't want to name the names, like the scheme of Government of India, like Ujjwala scheme, and then addressing nutritional security. So all these are the sort of saving the disposable income that was being spent on health, on all sorts of addressing the vulnerabilities. So that incremental saving will help them to invest in education and health. So that there is a radical shift in the focus. Earlier it was delivering the transfers from the government. There was leakages in between. Now through digital platforms,
I think we have...
leakages.
Oh, there. Talking about digital platforms, you froze for a moment on screen.
So I'm saying that, so there is a lot of process innovation in terms of the government programs which aim at addressing the severe economic vulnerability they have. And there is a stress on job opportunity, creating job opportunities, not just depending on the public sector to create jobs, but also whatever jobs are created in the informal sector and self-employment opportunities. So these are some of the things that are happening in a nutshell. Time would not permit to get into the details, but in the subsequent question, I can tell you certain things which help India to sort of lift from a very bottom level to see that the progress is happening. So I'll stop here and get back to you the next question.
Well,
thank you.
Thank you very much also for, reminding us that, of course, the colonial burden is a huge burden that many Asian, African, and even in the Middle East, that got independence only past century, many late 1940s, like India 47, 1960s, Africa, so that is a huge burden that would be, well, would need probably hours of in-depth study and reflection. But now I want to come back to our guest, Dr. Fosti, because many panelists addressed the food crisis, that, also the Ukraine war will worsen and will become much, much more dramatic. And it will worsen global poverty, and of course inequalities will be on the rise, and populations will be hit that have nothing to do with Ukraine or Russia. I'm thinking about Asia and of Africa. How do you think that this may affect the work of charitable foundations like yours?
Well, I would say that there is no room for debate about the relevance of the food crisis. In the world, 193 million people experience acute food insecurity, but I feel that we also need to know that in Italy, during lockdown, many children were forced to miss the only guaranteed meal of the day in school canteens because of the lockdown. So, according to FAO, the main drivers of the global food crisis remain three, which are conflict, extreme weather, and economic shocks. What can charitable foundations do? I think that we can contribute to think about the future in times of crisis. So we need to put together emergency approaches and systemic solutions. For example, and we need to start from the local level. In the city of Milan, for example, we started within there is a well-established project which is the Food Waste Hub project by the city of Milan with Fondazione Calipros Rete QB, and it was also awarded by a prestigious Earthshot Prize. This will offer resources to expand and improve this project about food waste. Also, philanthropic foundation can offer, of course, a vision of the future. They can experiment long-term solutions to tackle the roots of the problem. Of course, food is a very complex issue, which creates a necessity to work in alliance with many actors. Foundation can help these actors to have a broader understanding of the food crisis and to work together. Third point, contrasting the effects of the food crisis must be part of contrasting inequalities. We should not forget that inequalities are correlated one to each other. We need to work to contrast food poverty together with contrasting all inequalities. This means investing into the futures. Into the future so that part of our communities are not so vulnerable in times of crisis. The key, again, is education. For example, access to healthy food also depends on food environments, the living spaces and the options they offer. Working on our cities can influence how people experience food poverty. So in a time of crisis and emergency, foundations can contribute by experimenting, creating networks, and providing a vision of future so that solution can prevent this crisis in the future. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much also because, I mean, inequalities, food crisis brings to inequalities, and from experience, I mean, inequalities bring to social unrest, and in some ways, I mean, especially here in this city, in Milano, you have experienced it even recently. And of course, I mean, that is everyday life for many countries where social unrest stems from inequality. And it's even true from the US. But now let me go to Dr. Sanobe. So the world has become less and less equal, and unfortunately that is a fact, and the poor are the ones who suffer most. And in times of war, how to avoid that the world forgets the most vulnerable population?
Yeah, Maria, thank you very much. This is an excellent question. So all we know that extreme poverty reduced dramatically. So people living with less than 1.9 US dollars accounted for 40%, more than 40% of the world population in 1981, but only 10% in 2015. So after the outbreak of the pandemic, poverty increased again, and more recently further increased due to the food price hike, as Carolina clearly explained in the previous session. But the conclusion is the same. Extreme poverty has reduced dramatically compared with a few decades ago. And we know that huge reduction was driven in large part by the fast-growing economies of Asia, in particular China and India. So this is a common understanding among us. But many of us do not know, do not have precise knowledge about where extreme poverty remains. It's not necessarily concentrated in low-income countries. So actually, many are living in middle-income countries. So very recently, in one of the webinars my institute organized, I heard from Professor Rohini Pandey of Yale University about her study of hidden extreme poverty in middle-income countries. So let me introduce her finding and argument. So decline of poverty in those countries rising into middle-income status does not mean that countries are on track to end extreme poverty and no longer need assistance. Actually, there are large masses of extreme poor people living in these newly, middle-income countries. In 1987, 9 out of 10 extreme poor people generally lived in low-income countries. But by 2015, only 4 out of 10 live in low-income countries, while the rest live in middle-income countries. Over half of them in India, Nigeria, Bangladesh, Indonesia, Kenya, Yemen, South Africa, China, Pakistan, and Zambia. So Professor Pandey referred to these countries as high poverty middle-income countries. So based on the long recognition that middle-income countries are on track to end extreme poverty, so some advanced economies and the World Bank substantially increased their financing and aid for fragile states and the regions. And such redirection of global aid risks neglecting the hundreds of millions who may never escape poverty despite living in countries that are becoming relatively rich. So reducing or ending aid to high poverty, middle income countries will not be a problem if those countries could take care of their citizens. But these governments are often slow to redistribute income to the poor for two main reasons. So problems of capacity and the problems of will. So capacity means the capacity for domestic resource mobilization, and which the multilateral investment banks like ADB have been working on. But problem of will is or must be or likely to be more difficult to solve. So Professor Hilipande is now working on this problem. So I stop here. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Thank you. In fact, you mentioned that inequality, poverty is on the rise in middle-income countries, and that is surely true for India. So, Professor Daesh, what tools can you put in place to manage? I mean, poverty brings to migration, and at times also it can be very, very dramatic, like happened with the Rohingya population that is now in Bangladesh. So, what are the tools to manage migration more effectively than it has been now?
Maria, I think let us be very pragmatic in our approach. Besides leaving this distress migration caused due to war and other conflicts, political conflicts, the economic migration is obvious to happen. In an interconnected world where some pockets of prosperity giving more opportunities, it will happen. But your question is very right. How to manage that? The way countries becoming or thinking of the nationalistic orientation during Trump era, all these things, those could be self-defeating approach. For example, Indians working abroad and then South Asian workers exploring Indian market for jobs. These are the hard facts that will happen. But more than that, within country, the internal migration is also quite...
We have got again a digital divide, I suppose. Professor, you are frozen. I don't know if we can manage to, well, suppose that was proof what happens with digital divide. It is really a divide. So I thank Professor Daesh, if you can hear me. I thank also Professor Sonobe and Dr. Fosti. Thank you very much. And now I leave the stage for the conclusions to Paolo Magri.
Let's conclude together.
Oh, together.
Okay, would you mind?